Role-playing is an essential part of most D&D games. It is a tabletop role-playing game after all. But if you're anything like me, you might find it intimidating to really put yourself out there when you first start DMing. It can be hard to embody unique and real NPCs to help your players feel more immersed at the table. So what I want to do for this video is give you some tips that have helped me whenever I've been role-playing behind the screen to help bring your NPCs to life. Tips that I think can be helpful whether you're just starting out DMing or have been running the game for years. So without further ado, let's get into character and get started. It's hard to jump right into role-playing in character, but because a lot of folks come into D&D having seen it online or watching it in the media, they just kind of assume that's what you do. You put on a costume, you pick a character voice, and you start acting things out word for word. It is really challenging to jump right into first-person role-playing, and instead, a lot of people opt to instead do third-person role-playing first. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that you and your players probably aren't professional actors, so it is perfectly okay for you to instead describe what your characters are doing and describe what they're saying rather than going full-on in dialogue and character voices from the get-go. What is most important about role-playing is that you and your players feel comfortable and are enjoying the experience, more so than any acting you might be doing at the table. If you do go the third person route, just make sure you're still giving lots of great descriptions of what your characters are saying and what they sound like. There is a huge difference between, he says he doesn't know anything, and you see them shift in their chair a little bit. Their voice kind of wavers as they say they don't know anything about the break-in, but they're having trouble making eye contact. You still want to bring these NPCs to life and immerse your players in what's going on. And that goes for them too. It's not okay for them to just say, well, I rolled to persuade the guy. Ask them how they try to persuade them. What angle are they taking in the conversation? Are they taking into account that character's goals and ideals? Make sure that they are still role-playing even if you aren't using character voices. Now, some people are going to be perfectly fine diving right into first-person role-playing and full-on dialogue. And that's awesome. But if you're like me and need a little bit of time to warm up to it, there's nothing wrong with starting with third person. When I first started playing D&D with my friends, we swore we would never talk in character. Sure, we were nerds, and sure, we were playing Dungeons and Dragons, but for some reason, talking in character felt like a line we did not want to cross. The thing is, in my heart though, I knew that was something I wanted. I wanted to do dumb NPC voices and talk in character at the table. For a lot of people, when you're first starting out, talking in character can feel really silly. But being in character and talking in first person can make your games a lot more cinematic and immerse your players in a way that describing their actions can't always do. It also helps when your players can differentiate what NPC you're acting as just by the way they sound or the speech pattern that you're taking on. There's also a big difference between hearing the emotion in a character's voice and having it described to you instead. Like I said before, there's absolutely nothing wrong with role-playing in the third person. But if you're only not trying to talk in character because you're afraid of looking dumb, then my next piece of advice would be, get over yourself. It's D&D. Try not to take it too seriously. I know it can be hard to put yourself out there, even in front of close friends, but D&D is all about being somebody else, forgetting about the real world, and just kind of letting loose for a while and having fun playing a game together. So, if you're on the fence, I really strongly suggest just trying to talk in character once and seeing how it goes. Before long, you'll probably have everybody else doing it too. Sometimes when I get behind the screen, I feel this pressure to make my dialogue witty and snappy and come out quickly. In real life, conversations flow pretty naturally, so in the pursuit of immersion, sometimes I feel the need to try and make my NPC dialogue the same way. I mean, they manage to do it in TV and movies, so why not at my table? Well, obviously, D&D has no script, and it's really hard to come up with good dialogue on the fly, and it's even harder to make it feel effortless and snappy. A lot of the time what ends up happening, if you're just rushing to get words out and trying to make it feel like a natural free-flowing conversation, what ends up coming out isn't always great. And instead of sounding like the NPC that you're trying to portray, you just end up sounding like you as you default to the same vocabulary and phrases that you always use. If you watch some of the best DMs at work, instead of just rushing to blurt out whatever they can think of next, they'll take a moment to pause and think through their words. Sure, it might not be as free-flowing as a normal conversation, but their NPC dialogue ends up being a lot more impactful because they really put thought into it and took some time to really think of things from that NPC's perspective before speaking. So in your games, don't be afraid to take a breath, think it through for a beat, and then speak. You'll find that your NPC dialogue improves that way, and it ends up being a lot more immersive for your players and better off for your game. Whenever I break out an accent or a character voice at the table, I do my best to make it good. That being said, my southern drawl could use a little work, and my British accent certainly isn't straight out of London. I'm not an actor, and while I did star in my elementary school play, my skills leave a lot to be desired. But in all honesty, character voices don't really have to be good to be effective. The whole point of giving your characters different voices is to help your players differentiate them, when most of the time they won't have a visual aid to go off of. Sure, my voices might not be great, but my players are going to instantly know who they're talking to just based off of the voice that I'm using. There are, of course, limits to this. You don't want to use accents in a way that are offensive or stereotypical, and you should always be careful about what accents you pair up with which characters. If all of your villains use the same type of accent, well, what does that say about you and how you view the culture that accent comes from? Same goes for character voices. If all of your NPCs have crazy, over-the-top character voices, well, that's going to become annoying and distracting really quickly. All that said, accents and character voices can be a great tool for you to help your players differentiate between your different characters and make your game more immersive. And hey, even if you're not great at the accents, your players will probably appreciate you trying and at least enjoy watching the spectacle. Even if you hate doing accents, that doesn't mean all your characters have to sound the same. There are so many ways to change the way you sound, like how fast you talk. A character who talks super fast is going to come off very differently than one who talks slowly and deliberately and chooses their words carefully. Even changing your voice to be just a little bit deeper or a little bit higher can have a really big effect in how that character is perceived or heard by your players. You can also change up your speech pattern. A character who uses lots of speech fillers and pauses a lot is going to come off really differently than someone who is short, direct, and to the point all the time. You can even have your characters repeat phrases, kind of like an Animal Crossing character. There's a reason they do that in the game. By repeating phrases, you make that character memorable and instantly recognizable to your players. The vocabulary that your NPCs use will also probably vary based on who they are and their background. Something that I find myself doing is just defaulting to the same words and phrases that I use in real life, rather than whatever realistically the characters I'm trying to portray should be saying. For example, the bandit captain that your players are negotiating with probably sounds very different than the ancient red dragon whose lair they've stumbled into. A lot of people also change up their word choice based on whether they're in an informal or formal setting. That guy at the tavern who's getting drunk is probably going to use a very different set of words than the queen in her throne room. Role-playing is so much more than just funny voices. Even if you never use an accent, you can still bring your characters to life by changing up their speech pattern and the words that they're using. A lot of how we interact with people comes down to body language, the way that somebody slumps their shoulders when they're upset or leans back in surprise. We get a lot of emotion and understanding through reading people's movements and their reactions, and sometimes that can get lost in role-playing. If you're playing around a table with your friends or online with video where they can see you, I would strongly suggest really starting to get into it and move around a little bit. Use your body language as a tool to help convey understanding to your players. I'm not saying you have to get up and start running around your living room or tumbling during every combat, but even just simple gestures and motion can help take a conversation and make it feel more real. I also find that the more I get into it and the more that I'm moving around and really trying to embody that character, the easier it is for me to stay in that NPC's mindset. I, in real life, am not a dragon, but when I'm trying to portray one in D&D, if I'm hunched forward, leaning in, really glaring and snarling at the players, that just helps me stay in that mindset and really embody that character. So when you're behind the screen, don't feel like you have to be static the whole time. Don't be afraid to add a little motion to it. Not every NPC that your players meet is going to be friendly. I mean, villains are often some of the most fun characters to play. But on the flip side of that, not every NPC should be hostile, and I'm not just talking about by attacking your players. Sometimes DMs will default to making all of their characters kind of snarky and rude and end up belittling the party at every turn. And that can be kind of funny at first, but what ends up happening in the long run is that your players will start to be rude back, and it'll be harder for them to engage with your characters in a meaningful way if they're just expecting to get snark back anytime they try to engage with these characters. Now, I'm not saying every NPC has to be super overtly friendly to the party, and if one or two characters are kind of snippy and rude, then it can actually make them memorable and be funny when your players have to interact with them. But most people they come across should at least be neutral, if not friendly to them. And in the long run, if everyone they're interacting with is just rude and awful to deal with, it's going to be a real drag on your game. So do your players a favor and don't be too hostile with your NPCs. One of the biggest advantages that your NPCs in D&D have over, say, the characters in a video game, as good as that video game might be, is that you are free to react and adapt to whatever your players are doing, however you see fit. In a video game, the characters have programming they have to adhere to, scripts that they must follow, whereas in D&D, nothing is scripted. You have the choice to have your NPCs react to whatever shenanigans your players are bringing to the table, and that NPC's entire attitude toward the party can change based on whatever they're doing. In D&D, your players want to feel like they're impacting the world, and you can show that through your NPCs. A character who is friendly to the party might become closed off or guarded if they're acting strange or being rude. Or on the flip side, a character who was mean or not interested in working with your players might open up and become nicer if your players are being friendly or using their role playing to help that character out in some way. Entire quest lines can be started or failed just based on how seriously your players are taking the NPC that's trying to give them that quest. Your notes should dictate how your NPCs react to different things and maybe how they feel about the different antics that your players are getting up to, but you should always be adapting in the moment and using your role playing as a tool to make that world feel even more immersive and keeping your NPCs from being static and unchanging. So don't be afraid to really react to whatever your players are bringing to the table. One final tip. Just because you're role-playing doesn't mean you should forget about the dice. When you are wrapped up in a very tense negotiation or imparting deep lore on your players, it can be tough to remember that the dice should still be influencing events. Skills like persuasion, deception, and insight should be coming up fairly often in conversations, while knowledge-based skills like arcana and history can help inform how your players approach different conversations. This is especially true if you have a charisma-based character in your party. Too often, DMs will punish people because they stumble over their words when they're trying to describe how they persuade a guard or what they're doing to deceive a noble. You do want them to still be descriptive and still try to describe how they're approaching situations, but it would be foolish to punish people for not being as charismatic as their character. Let them use their character stats to help them in role playing. So don't forget to still let the dice be involved. I hope some of the tips in this video will be useful for you in running your own games and role playing your NPCs. Role playing can be one of the more challenging parts of DMing, but it can also be really fun and rewarding once you get the hang of it. This is not a comprehensive video, so if you have tips that have helped you in your own games, definitely leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear what other people do in their games to help really embody their NPCs. If you did like the video, please consider leaving a like and maybe even subscribing to the Bard's College. I make content about D&D and DMing and even give quests that you can use in your own games. So if you like what you saw, consider sticking around. But for now, good luck, and remember, crit your players.